The smell of burnt coffee and grease had soaked so deep into Maya Rodriguez's uniform that she couldn't remember what clean clothes felt like anymore, and as she stood behind the counter of Romano's diner at 2 in the morning, counting the meager tips from her double shift for the third time, hoping the numbers would somehow change, she felt the familiar weight of another rent payment looming like a storm cloud that never quite broke but never went away either. She'd been working at Romano's for 3 years now, ever since she dropped out of community college, when her mother's medical bills started piling up faster than she could count, and the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, some other version of Maya who hadn't learned that life had a way of taking your plans and crumpling them up like the receipt paper that kept jamming in the ancient register. The diner was nearly empty except for old Pete in his usual corner booth, nursing his 4th cup of decaf and pretending to read a newspaper from 2 weeks ago, and Maya didn't have the heart to tell him they were closing soon because she knew he had nowhere else to go, just like she knew that the $73.42 in tips she'd made tonight wouldn't be enough to cover both the electric bill and her mother's prescription refills. Her feet screamed inside the cheap sneakers she'd been wearing for 6 months past when they should have been replaced, the soles so thin she could feel every crack in the linoleum floor, and her lower back throbbed with that persistent ache that never quite went away no matter how many hours she spent not standing. The night manager, Darren, was in the back doing whatever it was Derek did when he disappeared for 20-minute stretches that always coincided with the arrival of his sketchy friend Tony, and Maya had learned not to ask questions because asking questions was a luxury for people who had other options. She wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that night, the same circular motion she'd been making for 3 years, wondering if this was all there was, if this endless cycle of grease and tips and exhaustion was what the rest of her life would look like, and the thought made something inside her chest feel too tight, like her lungs had forgotten how to expand all the way. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket and she already knew what it was before she looked. Another text from her mother asking if she could pick up the medications tonight instead of tomorrow morning, and Maya felt that familiar surge of love and resentment and guilt all tangled together in a knot she couldn't untie no matter how hard she tried. She texted back that she'd stop by the 24-hour pharmacy after her shift, knowing it would make her late for her morning shift at the cleaning company where she scrubbed office toilets for $9 an hour, but what else could she do when the woman who'd raised her single-handedly was slowly losing her hearing and her mobility and her independence to an autoimmune disease that the doctors couldn't quite figure out, and the insurance company wouldn't quite cover. The bell above the door chimed and Maya looked up with her automatic customer service smile already sliding into place, but it faltered when she saw who walked in because Romano's diner at 2 in the morning usually didn't get men in $1,000 suits accompanied by women dripping with jewelry that probably cost more than Maya would make in 5 years. The man was maybe 40, with that particular kind of polish that came from personal trainers and tailored clothes and never having to worry about whether you could afford both dinner and rent, and the woman with him was older, maybe 7, with silver hair styled in an elegant updo and a presence that made the dingy diner feel even dingier by comparison. They stood in the doorway for a moment, the man scanning the room with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering this decision, and Maya noticed the way he kept his hand lightly on the older woman's elbow, guiding her. Protect. Derek emerged from the back with suspiciously red-rimmed eyes and immediately straightened up, his usual slouch disappearing as he took in the expensive visitors, and Maya could practically see the dollar signs forming in his head as he hurried over to greet them with a level of enthusiasm he'd never once shown during a staff meeting. The man said something quiet to Derek, who nodded vigorously and led them to the best booth in the place, which wasn't saying much considering the rip in the vinyl had been patched with duct tape and the table wobbled, unless you shoved a folded napkin under the left leg. But Derek was treating them like they were royalty slumming it in his kingdom. Maya grabbed 2 menus and a pot of fresh coffee, squaring her shoulders and reminding herself that a customer was a customer regardless of how much their watch cost, and made her way over to the booth with her best smile firmly in place, even though every muscle in her body was screaming for her to sit down just for a minute, just to take the weight off her feet. She approached the table and started her usual greeting, but something made her pause, some instinct she couldn't name, and that's when she noticed the way the older woman wasn't quite looking at her, the way her eyes seemed to focus on Maya's face, but not quite track the movement of her lips, and suddenly Maya understood. Maya's hands moved before her brain fully caught up with what she was doing, her fingers forming the signs for good evening and welcome with a fluidity that came from years of practice, and the older woman's face underwent such a dramatic transformation that it actually made Maya take a step back, the polite mask of pleasant disconnection shattering into something raw and overwhelmed, and achingly grateful. The woman's hands flew up in response, signing back with an eagerness that spoke of someone who rarely got to use their native language, and Maya felt her own smile becoming genuine for the first time that night as she continued the conversation in ASL, asking what they'd like to drink and whether they needed time with the menu. The man in the suit had gone completely still, his hand frozen halfway to the laminated menu, his mouth slightly open in an expression of such profound shock that under different circumstances, Maya might have found it funny, but there was something else in his face too, something that looked almost like pain, mixed with wonder, and she couldn't quite figure out what she'd done to put it there. He recovered after a moment, clearing his throat and looking between Maya and the older woman with an intensity that made Maya suddenly self-conscious about the coffee stain on her uniform and the way her hair was falling out of its ponytail. But when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent, in a way that seemed completely at odds with his obviously expensive everything. He asked her where she learned to sign, his eyes never leaving her face, and Maya felt that familiar defensive wall start to go up because people always wanted to know why a diner waitress would know ASL, as if poverty meant you couldn't have depth or history or reasons for the things you knew. She kept her answer simple, explaining that her mother had been losing her hearing for the past 5 years, and Maya had learned alongside her, attending free community classes at the library and practicing with YouTube videos until her fingers ached, because what else was she supposed to do when the woman who raised her was slowly being cut off from the world of sound? The older woman reached out and grasped Maya's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and signed something that made Maya's throat tighten unexpectedly because the woman was thanking her, not just for taking their order, but for seeing her, for acknowledging her in a way that apparently didn't happen often enough. The man translated unnecessarily, his voice rough with some emotion Maya couldn't identify, and she realized that he probably spent a lot of time translating for his mother, being her voice in spaces that didn't accommodate her needs. And suddenly the protective way he'd guided her into the diner made perfect sense. Maya took their order, the older woman requesting the vegetable omelette and herbal tea, while the man ordered coffee and whatever pie was still fresh. And as Maya walked back to the counter to input their order into the ancient computer system that took 3 tries to register anything, she could feel their eyes on her back, and it made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't articulate. Derek materialized at her elbow with his fake manager smile, the one he used when he wanted something, and asked in a low voice if she knew who that was sitting in booth 7. When Maya shrugged, he looked at her like she'd just admitted to not knowing what water was, explaining in an excited whisper that was definitely too loud, that the man was Marcus Chen, as in Chen Industries. Marcus Chen, as in owns half the commercial real estate in 3 states. Marcus Chen, as in Billionaire. Marcus Chen. Maya looked back at the booth where the billionaire was carefully cutting his mother's omelette into smaller pieces, arranging everything on her plate with the kind of attention that spoke of years of practice, and she felt something twist in her chest, because money and power and influence didn't change the fundamental human need to take care of the people you love. And watching this man, who probably had assistants to tie his shoes, fuss over his mother's breakfast in a rundown diner at 2 in the morning, was somehow one of the most beautiful things Maya had seen in a long time. She delivered their continuing to sign with the older woman whose name she learned was Eleanor, and Eleanor's face lit up every time Maya's hands moved, like she was a plant that had been dying of thirst and was finally getting water, and Maya found herself staying at their table longer than she should, asking about Eleanor's life and sharing bits of her own, their hands dancing in the space between them, while Marcus watched with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to read. Eleanor asked about Maya's mother, and Maya found herself explaining more than she'd intended about the medical bills and the medications and the way her mother tried to pretend she wasn't scared of a world that was becoming increasingly silent, and Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide as she signed that she understood that the isolation was sometimes worse than the deafness itself. Marcus had pulled out his phone and was typing something, but Maya didn't think much of it because rich people were always on their phones, always connected to some network of importance that people like Maya could never access. But then he looked up at her and asked a question that made her heart start beating faster in her chest, because he wanted to know if she'd ever considered working as an ASL interpreter, if she'd ever thought about making it more than just a personal skill. Maya's first instinct was to laugh because the idea of someone like her working as a professional interpreter was absurd. She barely had her GED and her only credentials were a stack of certificates from free library classes that probably weren't worth the paper they were printed on. But something in Marcus Chen's face stopped the laugh before it could escape, and she realized he was completely serious, deadly serious in a way that made her stomach do a strange flip. He explained that his mother's previous interpreter had retired 3 months ago and they'd been cycling through agencies ever since, but none of them had Eleanor's trust, none of them made her light up the way she had tonight with Maya, and he'd been watching his mother become increasingly withdrawn and isolated, despite his best efforts to find someone who could bridge the gap between her world and everyone else's. Maya wanted to explain that she wasn't qualified, that there was a huge difference between signing with your own mother in the privacy of your apartment and interpreting in professional settings for a woman who apparently attended charity galas and board meetings and God knows what else. But Eleanor was looking at her with such hope in her eyes that the words died in Maya's throat. Marcus pulled a business card from his wallet, the kind of heavy cardstock that probably cost more per card than Maya spent on groceries in a week, and slid it across the table with a gesture that was casual, but somehow felt monumental, explaining that he wanted to set up a trial period, maybe a month, where Maya would work as Eleanor's personal interpreter and companion, and the salary he mentioned made Maya's knees actually buckle a little bit, because it was more than she made in 6 months at both her jobs combined. She stood there holding the business card like it might explode, brain trying to process what was happening, while her exhausted body was already calculating how many shifts she could drop, how many hours of sleep she could finally get, how many of her mother's medical bills she could actually pay instead of just pushing them to the bottom of the pile and hoping they'd somehow disappear. But there was a catch, there was always a catch, and Maya forced herself to ask what it was because nothing in her life had ever come easy, and she wasn't naive enough to think that was changing now. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been respect flickering across his face, and he explained that the job would require her to be available most days, sometimes long hours, sometimes events in the evening, and she'd need to commit fully because Eleanor didn't do well with constant changes in her support system. Maya thought about Romano's diner and her cleaning job, and the way Derek would probably fire her the second she gave notice anyway, because he'd never liked her refusal to laugh at his inappropriate jokes, and she thought about her mother and the mountain of debt that grew taller every month, no matter how many hours she worked. The decision should have been easy, but Maya had learned the hard way that things that seemed too good to be true usually were, and she found herself hesitate, looking between Marcus's carefully neutral expression and Eleanor's hopeful face, wondering what the real cost would be because everything had a cost even if it wasn't immediately obvious. Derek chose that moment to walk past their slowing down just enough to make it obvious he was eavesdropping, and Maya saw him clock the business card in her hand, saw the way his eyes narrowed with that petty vindictiveness he was famous for, and she knew that regardless of whether she took Marcus's offer, her job at Romano's was probably already over, because Derek didn't like his employees having opportunities that didn't involve him getting a cut. Eleanor signed something that Marcus didn't translate immediately, and when Maya looked at the older woman questioningly, Eleanor repeated it slowly, deliberately, her hands forming the words for please and trust and chance, and Maya felt something crack open in her chest, because this wealthy woman who could have anything she wanted was asking Maya for something, was making herself vulnerable in a way that seemed impossible for someone of her obvious status and privilege. Marcus finally translated, adding that his mother rarely connected with people, that the isolation of her deafness had been compounded by the isolation of their wealth, and most people either treated her like she was invisible or like she was a charity case to be pitied, but Maya had treated her like a person, like someone worth having a real conversation with, and that was apparently rarer than diamonds in Eleanor Chen's world. Maya's phone buzzed in her apron pocket and she knew without looking that it was another text from her mother, probably asking if she'd forgotten about the pharmacy, and the reminder of why she was standing in a diner at 2 in the morning working her second shift of the day, made the decision crystallize in her mind with sudden clarity. She asked when she could start, her voice sounding strange to her own ear, and Marcus's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed him from intimidating billionaire to someone who looked almost boyish in his relief, and he said she could start Monday if that worked for her, and Maya nodded even though she had no idea how she was going to explain this to anyone, least of all herself. They exchanged phone numbers, Marcus insisting she program his personal cell into her contacts, and Eleanor hugged Maya with a fierceness that suggested she knew exactly how big a leap of faith this was for both of them. And when they finally left the diner, leaving a tip that was more than Maya made in a week, she stood holding the business card and wondering if she'd just made the best decision of her life or the worst. The apartment that came with the job was the kind of place Maya had only seen in magazines that she'd never been able to afford to buy. All floor-to-ceiling windows and marble countertops, and a bathroom that was bigger than the entire studio she shared with her mother. And when Marcus's assistant had handed her the keys on Monday morning, Maya had actually asked if this was some kind of test, because surely they didn't expect her to actually live here. But Marcus had been adamant that Eleanor needed someone who could be available at unusual hours, and having Maya close by in the building's staff apartments, which apparently meant luxury accommodations that would make most people's primary residences look shabby, just made sense from a practical standpoint. Maya spent the first night sitting on the pristine white couch, afraid to touch anything, convinced that she was going to break something expensive or track dirt on the spotless floors or somehow reveal herself as the imposter she clearly was, but eventually exhaustion won out and she fell asleep in the bedroom with its impossibly soft sheets, and woke up at 5 a.m. in a panic because she'd forgotten to set an alarm for her diner shift before remembering that she didn't work at the diner anymore, didn't have to work at the diner anymore, and the relief was so intense it almost felt grief. Her first official day working for Eleanor was a baptism by fire, because apparently the older woman had a schedule that would exhaust someone half her age, starting with a board meeting at 9 a.m. for one of her charitable foundations that focused on accessibility rights for disabled individuals, and Maya found herself standing in a conference room full of people in designer suits, feeling like a child playing dress-up in the clothes. Marcus had insisted on buying her because her waitress uniform obviously wouldn't work. She interpreted for 3 solid hours, her hands moving through complex discussions about funding allocation and program effectiveness and legal frameworks, and halfway through she had a moment of pure terror, where she was convinced she was going to mess up some crucial piece of information and get Eleanor, or worse, get someone hurt by her incompetence. But Eleanor kept giving her small nods of encouragement and once reached over to squeeze her hand during a break, and somehow Maya made it through without completely falling apart. The other board members had watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism, and Maya could practically hear them wondering where Eleanor had found this interpreter, why she'd chosen someone so young and obviously inexperienced. But by the end of the meeting, even the skeptics seemed grudgingly impressed by how seamlessly Maya managed to convey not just Eleanor's words, but her tone and her intention, the subtle nuances that made interpretation an art rather than just a mechanical translation. Marcus had been in the meeting too, sitting at Eleanor's right hand, and Maya noticed the way he watched her work with an intensity that made her self-conscious, like he was evaluating every gesture, every choice she made, and she couldn't tell if she was meeting whatever standard he'd set in his mind. After the meeting, Eleanor insisted on taking Maya to lunch at a restaurant where the cheapest item on the menu cost more than Maya used to spend on food in a week, and they sat in a booth by the window overlooking the city, and had what felt like their first real conversation, hands moving in the silent language that was becoming increasingly natural to Maya. Eleanor asked about her life, really, not in the polite way people did when they didn't actually care about the answer, but with genuine curiosity and empathy, and Maya found herself opening up about her mother and the fear that haunted her every day that she wouldn't be able to do enough, wouldn't be able to save her from the isolation and pain that seemed inevitable. Eleanor's face grew sad and she signed that she understood that fear from the other side, that she'd watched her own son try to fix the unfixable, try to compensate for her disability with money and resources and sheer determination, and while she appreciated everything he did, what she really needed was what Maya had given her that first night in the diner, someone who saw her as a person first and a deaf person second. The confession made something shift in Maya's understanding of this job, made her realize that she'd been so focused on whether she was qualified enough, competent enough, professional enough, that she'd missed the actual point, which was that Eleanor didn't need perfect interpretation as much as she needed genuine connection. They spent the afternoon at a museum, Eleanor's choice, and Maya interpreted not just for conversations but for the exhibition labels and audio guide, translating the stories behind the art into signs that Eleanor received with the hunger of someone who'd been starved for culture and beauty. And Maya realized that this was what her job really meant, opening doors that had been closed, building bridges across the silence. When they got back to the building that evening, Maya, exhausted but in a completely different way than her diner shifts had exhausted her, Marcus was waiting in the lobby, and the expression on his face when he saw them, his mother laughing at something Maya had just signed, was so unguarded and relieved that Maya felt like she was intruding on a private moment. The call came at 3 in the morning. 2 weeks into Maya's new position, Marcus's voice tight with barely controlled panic, asking if she could get to the hospital immediately, because Eleanor had collapsed at a charity event, and the ER staff couldn't communicate with her, and she was terrified and agitated, and possibly having a stroke, and he needed Maya there now, right now, because his mother was scared and he couldn't fix it. Maya was dressed and out the door in under 3 minutes, her heart hammering against her ribs as she ran the 4 blocks to St. Catherine's Medical Center, because it was faster than waiting for a car, and she burst through the emergency room doors, still wearing the sweatpants she'd fallen asleep in, to find Marcus in the waiting area, looking more disheveled and human than she'd ever seen him, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his tie pulled loose, his hair standing up like he'd been running his hands through it, compulsively. He grabbed her arm the second he saw her, not roughly but with the desperate grip of someone drowning, and pulled her toward the examination rooms where they could hear a commotion, raised voices and the sound of something clattering to the floor, and when they pushed through the curtain, Maya's heart broke a little at the sight of Eleanor, backed into the corner of the hospital bed, her elegant composure completely shattered, her hands signing frantically, but with no one to receive her words, a young nurse trying to approach with a blood pressure cuff, while Eleanor shook her head violently and signed no, 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 over and over again. Maya moved immediately into Eleanor's line of sight, her hands already forming the signs for "I'm here, you're safe, I'm here," and the transformation was instantaneous, Eleanor's panic-stricken expression melting into relief, so profound that tears started streaming down her face, and she reached for Maya with shaking hands, signing that she didn't understand what was happening, why she was here, what they wanted from her, and Maya felt a surge of anger at the medical staff, who had apparently not bothered to figure out how to communicate with their patient before trying to treat her. She turned to the doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, and explained in the calmest voice she could manage that her patient was deaf and needed all communication to go through Maya as her interpreter, and the doctor had the grace to look embarrassed as she started explaining Eleanor's condition, while Maya translated everything into signs that Eleanor could understand. It turned out not to be a stroke but a severe anxiety attack brought on by dehydration and exhaustion. Eleanor's blood pressure had spiked and she'd passed out during a speech at the charity gala, and while she was physically fine, the experience of waking up in a hospital surrounded by people trying to touch her and talk at her without any way to understand what they were saying had sent her into a full-blown panic. Maya stayed by Eleanor's side through every examination, every blood draw, every check of vita, her hands moving constantly to translate the medical jargon into something Eleanor could process, and she noticed how Eleanor's grip on her hand grew tighter whenever the doctors discussed anything serious, how the older woman who had seemed so confident and self-possessed in every other context became small and vulnerable in this sterile medical environment. Marcus stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, and Maya saw him wipe his eyes when he thought no one was looking, saw the way his jaw clenched every time Eleanor flinched at an unexpected touch, and she realized that for all his wealth and power, he was completely helpless in this situation, unable to protect his mother from the fundamental disconnect between her needs and a system that wasn't built to accommodate them. The sun was rising by the time they got Eleanor stabilized and cleared for discharge, and as they waited for the final paperwork, Eleanor signed to Maya that she was sorry for calling her in the middle of the night, sorry for being so much trouble, sorry for being weak, and Maya felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest as she signed back that Eleanor had nothing to apologize for, that the system had failed her, not the other way around, and that Maya would always come when she was needed, always, because that's what this job meant and what their relationship meant beyond the job. Marcus drove them home in his Tesla. Eleanor dozing in the back seat with her head on Maya's shoulder, and at a red light he turned to look at Maya with an expression of such raw gratitude that it made her uncomfortable, and he said thank you in a voice rough with emotion, said that he'd been terrified, absolutely terrified, that something would happen to his mother in a situation where he couldn't help her, and having Maya there had been the only thing that made the nightmare manageable. Maya didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded, and they drove the rest of the way in silence. And when they got back to the building, Marcus insisted on walking them both up even though it was clear he was running on empty himself, and as they stood outside Eleanor's door, the older woman pulled Maya into a hug, and signed against her shoulder that Maya wasn't just her interpreter, she was family now, and Maya felt something that had been locked tight in her chest for years start to loosen just a little bit. The annual Chen Industries Foundation Gala was apparently the social event of the season, or at least that's what Marcus's assistant Emma kept telling Maya, as she tried to help her get ready for the event, and Maya stood in front of the full-length mirror in her apartment feeling like an imposter in the midnight blue gown that some personal stylist had picked out, the kind of dress that probably cost more than her old car and made her feel both beautiful and completely fraudulent at the same time. She'd been working for Eleanor for 6 weeks now and had gotten comfortable with board meetings and lunch dates and afternoon museum visits, but a ballroom full of billionaires and celebrities and politicians was a different beast entirely, and Maya's anxiety was making her hands shake slightly as she tried to fasten the delicate silver bracelet that complemented her dress. Eleanor had insisted that Maya needed to look the part, that people in their world judged everything including the competence of someone's staff by their appearance, and while the logic made Maya bristle at its superficiality, she understood the practical reality that she represented Eleanor and by extension Marcus, and showing up in her waitress uniform would undermine Eleanor's credibility before she even had a chance to speak. The gala was being held in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, the kind of place with marble columns and crystal chandeliers and staff in white gloves, and when Maya walked in with Eleanor and Marcus, she felt every eye in the room turn to assess them, to calculate who they were and whether they mattered, and she had to remind herself to breathe normally and not let her hands betray her nervousness. Eleanor looked radiant in a champagne-colored gown that probably had a designer name Maya wouldn't recognize, her silver hair swept up in an elegant chignon, and she moved through the room with a confidence that came from 70 years of navigating spaces like this. But Maya noticed the way Eleanor's hand found hers almost immediately, the older woman's fingers squeezing gently as if to say, "I need you here with me." The evening was a blur of introductions and small talk, Maya's hands moving constantly as she interpreted conversations about stock portfolios and real estate developments and political campaigns, and she found herself having to translate not just the words but the subtext, the implications and innuendos that seemed to make up half of how these people communicated. Marcus stayed close, playing his role as Eleanor's protective son, but Maya caught him watching her work with that same intense evaluation he'd had during their first board meeting, and she couldn't tell if he was impressed or worried that she was about to make some catastrophic social error. About an hour into the event, a situation developed that made Maya's blood run cold because she realized that she was about to become the center of attention in exactly the way she'd been hoping to avoid. Eleanor had been asked to give a speech about the foundation's work in accessibility advocacy, and Maya had prepared for this, had practiced the interpretation until her hands ached, but what she hadn't prepared for was the moment when Eleanor stepped up to the microphone and the entire ballroom full of hundreds of people fell silent and turned to watch, and Maya realized that she would be standing on that stage next to Eleanor, her interpretation visible to everyone, her competence on display for a room full of people who probably had opinions about everything including the quality of Eleanor's interpretation. She climbed the steps to the small stage on legs that felt disconnected from her body, taking her position slightly behind and to the side of Eleanor where she'd be visible but not obtrusive, and Eleanor turned to give her a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring but mostly just reminded Maya how much was riding on her not screwing this up. Eleanor began to speak, or rather began to sign, and Maya interpreted aloud, her voice carrying through the sound system to every corner of the room, translating Eleanor's passionate words about dignity and access and the fundamental human right to participate fully in society regardless of physical ability. The speech was beautiful and eloquent and deeply personal, Eleanor sharing stories from her own life about the barriers she'd faced and the small victories she'd won, and Maya found herself getting caught up in the emotion of it, her voice strengthening as she channeled Eleanor's conviction and passion, forgetting for a moment that hundreds of wealthy strangers were watching her every move. She noticed movement in the crowd, people pulling out their phones, and her first thought was that they were being rude, not paying attention to Eleanor's important message. But then she realized they were filming, capturing this moment of Eleanor Chen giving a speech in her own voice through Maya's interpretation, and suddenly the weight of what she was doing hit her like a physical force. This wasn't just a job, wasn't just about helping one wealthy woman navigate her day. This was about visibility and representation, and showing a room full of influential people that disability didn't mean inability, that communication could take many forms, and that Eleanor Chen was a force to be reckoned with regardless of whether she could hear the applause that erupted when she finished her speech. The applause was thunderous, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that went on, and Eleanor turned to Maya with tears in her eyes, signing "Thank you, thank you, thank you," and Maya signed back that she'd only transmitted Eleanor's words. The power had been all Eleanor's, but even as she signed it she knew it wasn't entirely true, because the interpretation had required something more than mechanical translation. It had required understanding and empathy and a connection that went beyond words, in any language. After the gala, Marcus suggested they have a nightcap on the building's rooftop terrace, just the three of them, to decompress from the intensity of the evening, and Maya was too exhausted to argue or wonder if this was appropriate or read into the invitation anything beyond its surface meaning. Eleanor begged off almost immediately, claiming she was tired, which she was, but Maya caught the knowing look the older woman gave her son before she left, and it made something flutter nervously in Maya's stomach. The rooftop was beautiful in that effortless way that came from having unlimited money to spend on ambiance, string lights and comfortable furniture, and a view of the city that made you feel like you were floating above all the problems and chaos happening in the streets below. And Maya kicked off the heels that had been torturing her feet for the past 4 hours and sank into a plush chair with a sigh that was probably not very professional, but she was too tired to care. Marcus poured them both wine from a bottle that probably cost more than her old monthly rent, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the city drifting up from below, distant sirens and car horns, and the general hum of life happening to other people, and Maya felt the adrenaline from the evening slowly draining out of her body, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that was somehow satisfying in a way her diner shifts had never been. Marcus spoke first, his voice quiet in the darkness, saying that he'd watched her tonight and been amazed by her skill, her grace under pressure, the way she'd managed to interpret his mother's passion without losing any of the nuance or emotion, and Maya felt her cheeks heat up because she'd never been good at accepting compliments, especially from men who looked like Marcus and had everything in the world, including the power to fire her if he decided she wasn't good enough. But then Marcus said something that made Maya's breath catch in her throat, because he told her that his mother hadn't been happy in years. Not truly happy, that the deafness had isolated her in ways that all his money couldn't fix, and watching her come alive over the past 6 weeks, seeing her laugh and engage and connect with the world again through Maya's interpretation, had been the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. Maya didn't know what to say to that, so she took a sip of wine and stared out at the city lights and tried not to think about how complicated her feelings about this job and this family were becoming, how she'd started out thinking of it as just a paycheck, a way to solve her financial problems. But somewhere along the line Eleanor had stopped being her employer and started being something closer to a grandmother, and Marcus had stopped being the intimidating billionaire and started being just a man who loved his mother fiercely and was doing his best in a situation that had no perfect solutions. Marcus asked about her mother, how she was doing, whether the new treatment plan Maya had been able to afford with her new salary was helping, and Maya felt something loosen in her chest at the genuine concern in his voice, the fact that he'd remembered this detail about her life and cared enough to follow up on. She told him about her mother's progress, how the new medications were slowing the progression of her hearing loss, how they'd been able to hire a part-time aide to help with daily tasks, how for the first time in years, Maya wasn't lying awake at 3 a.m. doing math in her head, trying to figure out which bills to pay and which to let slide, and she heard her own voice crack a little bit on the last part, because the relief of not living in constant financial terror was still so new that sometimes it overwhelmed her. Marcus reached over and took her hand, just held it, no romantic gesture or ulterior motive, just human contact and comfort, and they sat like that for a long time. Two people from completely different worlds who'd somehow found themselves in this strange intersection, where money and need and genuine affection had created something neither of them had expected. He told her about his father, who'd died when Marcus was 23, leaving him to take over a business empire he'd barely understood, and a mother who was just beginning to lose her hearing, and how he'd spent the past 15 years trying to be enough for everyone, to fill the gaps his father had left, to protect his mother from a world that seemed determined to exclude her, and how exhausting it was to always be the person holding everything together. Maya squeezed his hand and said that she understood that she'd been holding her own world together with duct tape and willpower for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to share the weight with someone else. And when Marcus looked at her in the dim light of the string lights overhead, she saw recognition in his eyes, the acknowledgement of shared experience even if the details were wildly different. He asked if she was happy, working for them, and Maya realized that no one had asked her that question in years. People asked if she was managing, if she was getting by, if she was but no one asked if she was actually happy, and she had to think about the answer because happiness had seemed like such a luxury for so long that she'd stopped considering it a realistic goal. But sitting there on that rooftop with the city spread out below them, and the memory of Eleanor's triumphant speech still warm in her chest and the weight of financial security finally lifting off her shoulders, Maya realized that she was happy, genuinely happy. Maybe for the first time since her mother had gotten sick and her whole life had derailed from the path she'd planned. She told Marcus this, told him about the dreams she'd had to abandon, and the version of herself she'd thought she'd lost, and how working for Eleanor had given her back something she'd thought was gone forever, a sense of purpose and value that went beyond just survival. And when she finished talking she realized there were tears running down her face, and Marcus was crying too. And they sat there together on that rooftop, being vulnerable and human in a way that neither of them probably allowed themselves to be very often. The conversation shifted after that, became lighter, and they talked about books and music and the ridiculous pretensions of the people at the gala, and Maya found herself laughing in a way she hadn't laughed in years, the kind of laughter that came from genuine joy rather than polite social obligation. And when Marcus walked her back to her apartment in the early hours of the morning, she felt like something fundamental had shifted between them, like they'd crossed some invisible line from employer and employee to something more complicated and infinitely more fragile. The trouble started on a Tuesday afternoon when Maya and Eleanor were leaving a doctor's appointment, just a routine checkup that had gone well, and they were walking to the car where Marcus's driver was waiting, when a group of photographers materialized seemingly out of nowhere, cameras clicking and flashing, voices shouting questions that made no sense to Maya until she realized they were asking about some business deal Marcus was supposedly involved in, some controversial development project that apparently had people upset. Eleanor's face went pale and her hands started shaking, and Maya immediately moved to shield her, positioning her body between the older woman and the aggressive crowd of paparazzi, who seemed to have no concern for the fact that they were terrorizing a 70-year-old woman who couldn't even hear their shouted justifications for their behavior. One particularly aggressive photographer shoved his camera directly in Eleanor's face, and Maya snapped, actually physically pushed the camera away, and told the man in a voice that came out harder and more dangerous than she'd known. She was capable of that if he touched Eleanor again. She would break his camera and possibly his face, and the photographer had the audacity to look offended as if he was the victim in this situation. Eleanor was signing frantically, asking what was happening, why these people were surrounding them, and Maya tried to interpret while simultaneously keeping the photographers at bay, her hands moving in short, sharp gestures that probably weren't grammatically perfect but got the meaning across, and she could see Eleanor's anxiety building, the older woman's breath coming faster as the crowd pressed closer despite Maya's attempts to keep them back. The driver finally managed to push through the crowd and get the car door open, and Maya practically lifted Eleanor into the back seat before climbing in after her and slamming the door, and as they pulled away from the curb, Maya could see the photographers still taking pictures, still shouting questions that no one in the car could hear or cared to answer. Eleanor was trembling, her hands signing over and over that she was sorry, so sorry for the disruption, and Maya felt a surge of anger so intense it almost frightened her because this woman had done nothing wrong, had simply existed while having a famous son, and somehow that made her fair game for this kind of harassment. She pulled Eleanor into a hug, something she'd never done before because their relationship had always maintained a certain professional boundary, but in that moment professionalism seemed less important than comfort, and Eleanor clung to her like a drowning person to a life raft, and Maya signed against her shoulder that it wasn't her fault, that those people were terrible and invasive and Eleanor had nothing to apologize for, nothing at all. When they got back to the building, Marcus was waiting in the lobby, and one look at Eleanor's face told him everything he needed to know, and his expression went from concerned to absolutely furious in the space of a heartbeat. He wanted detail, wanted to know which publication the photographers had been from, wanted names so he could call his lawyers and make their lives hell, and Maya found herself in the strange position of having to calm him down even though she was just as angry, explaining that going to war with the press would only make things worse, would only invite more attention and more harassment, and what Eleanor needed right now was safety and quiet, and the chance to decompress from the trauma of the experience. Marcus looked at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language, like the concept of not immediately retaliating against people who had hurt his mother was completely alien to his worldview, and Maya realized that this was probably how he'd survived in the ruthless world of business, by hitting back twice as hard whenever someone came at him or his family. But Eleanor wasn't a business deal, and this situation required a different approach. She convinced him to take Eleanor upstairs and stay with her for a while, to just be present and calm, and reassure, and Marcus nodded slowly like he was trying to absorb this completely different strategy, and as they walked to the elevator, Maya saw him take his mother's hand with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his angry posture and clenched jaw. Later that eve, after Eleanor had fallen asleep with the help of some anxiety medication her doctor had prescribed for situations exactly like this, Marcus showed up at Maya's door looking exhausted and defeated in a way she'd never seen him, and when she let him in he collapsed onto her couch and put his head in his hands and said that he couldn't do this anymore, couldn't protect his mother from a world that seemed determined to hurt her, and Maya sat down next to him and pointed out that maybe protection wasn't the goal, maybe the goal was adaptation, helping Eleanor build resilience and find ways to navigate a hostile world rather than trying to shield her from every possible harm. Marcus looked at her like she'd just solved some impossible equation, and he said that he'd spent 15 years trying to build walls high enough to keep his mother safe, hiring security and controlling access, and basically creating a bubble that would shield her from anything painful or difficult. But Maya had shown him in 6 weeks that what Eleanor really needed wasn't isolation but connection, wasn't protection but participation, and watching his mother thrive under Maya's care had forced him to question everything he thought he'd been doing right. The conversation went on for hours, Marcus opening up about his fears and failures in a way that Maya suspected he rarely did with anyone, and she found herself sharing her own insecurities, her constant worry that she wasn't good enough, wasn't qualified enough, wasn't sophisticated enough to really help Eleanor the way she deserved to be helped, and Marcus looked genuinely shocked that Maya could think this way, given how transformative her presence had been in their lives. He told her that he'd been watching her work, really watching, and what amazed him wasn't her technical skill with ASL, though that was impressive, but her emotional intelligence, her ability to read Eleanor's moods and needs and adjust her approach accordingly, her willingness to be fully present and engaged rather than just going through the professional motions, and he said that this quality, this genuine care and connection, was something no amount of money could buy and no amount of training could teach. Maya felt her throat tighten, because no one had ever described her work, her value in these terms before, and hearing it from someone like Marcus, who had every reason to maintain professional distance and every resource to find someone more qualified, made it hit differently, made her realize that maybe she'd been measuring herself against the wrong standards all along. The email came on a Saturday morning while Maya was having coffee and trying to pretend she wasn't obsessively checking her mother's blood pressure readings on the health monitoring app they'd set up, and when she opened it and saw that it was from a prestigious interpretation agency offering her a full-time position with benefits and a salary that was actually competitive with what Marcus was paying her, her first emotion was pride, followed immediately by a nauseating wave of anxiety because this changed everything. The agency had apparently seen video of her interpreting at the gala, someone had posted it online, and it had gone viral in the deaf community, and they were impressed enough by her work to offer her a position without the usual credential requirements, willing to sponsor her through the certification process while she worked, and this was exactly the kind of opportunity that could turn interpretation from a job into a career, from something she'd stumbled into out of necessity into something that could define her professional life. But taking the position would mean leaving Eleanor, leaving Marcus, leaving the strange little family unit they'd created over the past 3 months, and Maya felt physically sick at the thought of telling Eleanor that she was leaving, could already imagine the hurt in the older woman's eyes, even though Eleanor would probably insist that Maya should take the opportunity, should think about her future, should do what was best for her career. She sat with the email open on her laptop for hours, not responding, not deciding, just staring at the words on the screen and trying to figure out what she actually wanted, as opposed to what she thought she should want, and the distinction between those two things was becoming increasingly blurred. Her mother called in the afternoon, her voice stronger than it had been in years, thanks to the shirt Maya could now afford, and Maya found herself explaining the situation, laying out the pros and cons like this was a simple logical decision, rather than an emotional minefield that felt impossible to navigate. Her mother listened quietly and then asked a question that cut right to the heart of the matter, asking whether Maya was happy with Eleanor and Marcus, or whether she felt trapped by gratitude and obligation into staying in a situation that wasn't really what she wanted. Maya opened her mouth to answer and realized she didn't know, couldn't untangle her genuine affection for Eleanor from her very real awareness that this job had saved her financially, had given her access to a life she never could have afforded otherwise, and how could she know if her feelings were authentic when they were so thoroughly mixed up with material benefits? Her mother, in that way mothers have of cutting through complicated rationalization, pointed out that Maya had never talked about her diner job the way she talked about working with Eleanor, had never come home from cleaning offices with stories about meaningful interactions or moments of real connection, and maybe that difference was worth paying attention to. Maya hung up feeling more confused than ever, and that's when Marcus texted asking if she was free for dinner, just the three of them, nothing formal, and Maya's stomach twisted because she realized she was going to have to tell them about the offer and watch their faces as they processed the fact that she might leave, and the thought of causing Eleanor any kind of pain made her want to throw her phone across the room. Dinner was at Eleanor's apartment, something simple that Marcus had cooked himself, which was apparently a rare occurrence that Eleanor made a big deal of, with lots of teasing signed commentary about his limited culinary skill, and Maya tried to laugh and participate normally, but she could tell that both of them noticed something was off, because Eleanor kept giving her concerned looks and Marcus kept asking if she was feeling okay. Finally, halfway through dessert, Maya couldn't take it anymore and just blurted out that she'd received a job offer from an interpretation agency, and the words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and she watched Eleanor's face carefully to see the reaction and felt her heart break a little at the flash of pain that crossed the older woman's features before she got it under control. But what Eleanor signed next surprised Maya, because instead of asking her to stay or making her feel guilty, Eleanor said that this was wonderful news, that Maya deserved opportunities like this, that she'd always known Maya was too talented to stay in one position forever, and that if Maya decided to take the offer, Eleanor would support her completely, even though it would be hard to say goodbye. Marcus was less composed, his face going through several emotions in rapid succession before settling on something that looked like resignation mixed with grief, and he said quietly that of course Maya should do what was best for her career, that they'd known from the beginning that this arrangement might not be permanent, that they'd figure something out with another interpreter, even though they both knew no one else would be like Maya, no one else would connect with Eleanor the way Maya had. The rest of the dinner was subdued, everyone trying to pretend things were normal while they all processed this shift in their reality, and when Maya finally left to go back to her apartment, Eleanor hugged her so tightly that Maya could barely breathe, and the older woman signed against her shoulder that no matter what Maya decided, she would always be grateful for these months, always remember them as a time when she'd felt truly seen and understood and valued. Maya lay awake that night thinking about the diner, about the version of herself who'd stood behind that counter at 2 counting tips and wondering if this was all there was, and she realized that working for Eleanor hadn't just changed her financial situation, it had changed her understanding of what was possible, what she was capable of, what kind of life she could build if she stopped accepting whatever scraps the world offered and started demanding more. But taking the agency job felt like choosing ambition over connection, career advancement over the relationships that had come to mean so much to her, and Maya wasn't sure she was ready to make that trade even if it was the smart choice according to every external measure of success. She pulled out her phone and looked at pictures from the past 3 months, Eleanor laughing at the museum, Marcus's relieved face after the hospital crisis, the three of them on the roof after the gala, and she realized that these people had become her family in a way that transcended employment or professional relationships, and walking away from that wouldn't just be changing jobs, it would be leaving home. Maya made her decision on a Tuesday morning while watching Eleanor teach a sign language class at the community center that the Chen Foundation funded, watching the older woman's face light up as she helped other deaf adults learn to communicate, and Maya realized that what she'd been doing for the past 3 months wasn't just a job or even just interpretation, it was facilitating Eleanor's ability to give back, to connect, to share her experiences and her wisdom with others who needed it, and that role felt more meaningful than any prestigious agency position could ever be. She drafted her response to the agency that afternoon, thanking them for the opportunity but explaining that she'd decided to continue in her current position, and she felt surprisingly calm about the decision, no second-guessing or regret, just a clear sense that she was choosing the path that aligned with who she was rather than who she thought she should be. When she told Eleanor and Marcus that evening, Eleanor actually cried, signing that she'd been terrified of losing Maya, but hadn't wanted to be selfish by asking her to stay, and Marcus looked at Maya with an expression that was complicated and grateful, and something else she couldn't quite identify, but that made her heart beat faster in her chest. Marcus said he wanted to do something to mark the occasion, to celebrate Maya's decision to stay, and that's how they ended up back at Romano's diner, 3 days later, the three of them sitting in the same booth where this whole thing had started 4 months ago, and Maya felt like she was closing some kind of circle, even though she wasn't sure exactly what that meant. Derek was still the night manager, still disappearing for 20-minute stretch-in. He did a double take when he saw Maya walk in wearing designer clothes and accompanied by obvious wealth, and she saw him trying to reconcile this version of her with the exhausted waitress who used to work doubles and count her tips 3 times, hoping the numbers would somehow improve. They ordered exactly what they'd ordered that first night, Eleanor's vegetable omelette and Marcus's coffee and pie, and Maya interpreted as they chatted about everything and nothing, Eleanor telling stories from her youth, and Marcus sharing embarrassing childhood memories that made his mother laugh so hard she had to wipe her eyes. Other diners had started to notice them, and Maya saw phones coming out, people recognizing Marcus and then Eleanor and then presumably wondering who Maya was and why she was with them. But instead of the invasive aggression of the paparazzi incident, this felt different, people watching with curiosity and something that might have been admiration. One woman approached their table hesitantly, signing an apology for interrupting but explaining that she was deaf and had seen the video from the gala online, and she wanted to thank Eleanor for her advocacy work and Maya for showing what good interpretation could look like. And Eleanor invited the woman to sit with them for a few minutes, and soon they were deep in conversation about accessibility issues and community resources and the challenges of navigating a hearing world. More people approached after that, some deaf, some hearing but with deaf family members, some just curious about what they were witnessing, and their quiet dinner turned into an impromptu gathering that spilled across multiple tables as Eleanor held court, sharing her experiences and her wisdom, and her hope for a more inclusive future. Maya interpreted continuously for over an hour, her hands never stopping, translating not just for Eleanor, but facilitating conversations between deaf and hearing strangers who would never have spoken otherwise, and she realized that this exact thing happening right now was why she'd made the right choice, because money and prestige meant nothing compared to the feeling of building bridges between people who needed to understand each other. Marcus watched her work with an expression that had become increasingly unguarded over the past few months, and when there was finally a lull in the conversations and people started drifting back to their own tables, he reached across and took her hand in full view of everyone, including the people recording on their phone, and he said something that made Maya's breath catch, because he told her that watching her tonight, seeing her facilitate this organic moment of community and connection, had made him realize that what he felt for her had moved well beyond gratitude or professional respect, and if she was open to it, he'd like to explore whether this thing between them could become something more than employer and employee or even just friends. Eleanor was signing encouragement before Marcus had even finished speaking, telling Maya that she'd seen this coming for months. that the way they looked at each other wasn't exactly subtle, and that she would be delighted if Maya became part of the family in an official capacity and not just as her interpreter. And Maya felt her eyes filling with tears because this wasn't how she'd imagined her life going. This wasn't the plan she'd had back when she was counting tips at 2 a.m. and wondering if she'd ever get ahead, but somehow it was better than any plan she could have made because it was real and complicated and built on genuine connection rather than fantasy. She signed to Eleanor that she would be honored, that Eleanor had become more important to her than she knew how to express, and then she turned to Marcus and said yes. She wanted to explore whatever this was between them, wanted to see if the connection they'd built over late-night conversations and shared vulnerability could become something lasting and real. The other diners erupted in applause and Derek looked completely confused by what was happening in his diner, and old Pete raised his coffee cup in a toast from his corner booth, and Maya laughed through her tears and thought about all the versions of herself she'd been, the scared waitress and the determined daughter and the unqualified interpreter, who'd somehow stumbled into exactly where she was supposed to be. They stayed at the diner until closing time, and when they finally left, Marcus insisted on leaving a tip that would cover Derek's salary for a month, and Maya saw her former boss's eyes go wide as he counted the cash, and she felt a petty satisfaction that she tried to suppress but couldn't entirely eliminate. As they walked back to the car, Eleanor between them holding both their hands, Maya looked up at the night sky barely visible through the city lights and thought about how 4 months ago she'd been drowning in debt and exhaustion and hopelessness, and now she had a family and a career and the beginning of something that might be love, and the transformation felt so dramatic that part of her was still waiting for it all to disappear like a dream. But Eleanor squeezed her hand and Marcus smiled at her with that unguarded expression that she was starting to recognize as uniquely hers. And Maya realized that this wasn't a dream, this was her life now, complicated and beautiful and built on the simple act of seeing another person and being willing to bridge the gap between their world and yours. And that lesson, that fundamental truth about connection and communication and the power of really seeing each other, was worth more than all the money in Marcus's bank account or all the prestigious jobs in the world. The video of their impromptu gathering at Romano's went viral within days, not because of Marcus's fame or Eleanor's wealth, but because people responded to the authenticity of a genuine human connection that couldn't be faked or manufactured. And Maya found herself fielding calls from other wealthy families looking for interpreters, from organizations wanting to hire her as a consultant, from opportunities that would have seemed impossible just months ago, but she turned most of them down, accepting only the occasional guest speaking engagement or workshop, because her priority was Eleanor, was this family she'd found in the most unexpected place, was building a life that valued connection over achievement and meaning over status. 6 months later, Maya stood as Eleanor's maid of honor when Marcus married a woman he'd met at one of the foundation events, a deaf artist who signed poetry and made Eleanor laugh until she cried, and Maya realized that her role had evolved again, that she wasn't just Eleanor's interpreter anymore, but truly part of this family in all its complicated and beautiful iterations. And on the first anniversary of that night in Romano's diner, when an exhausted waitress had signed to a deaf woman and changed all their lives, Maya and Eleanor and Marcus's new wife all went back to that booth, and ordered the same food and toasted to the power of unexpected connections. And Maya thought about the girl she'd been and the woman she was becoming and felt grateful for every difficult step that had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this life that was so much richer than anything she could have planned or predicted, or even dreamed, was possible.